When I think about the evolution of my art practice, I think about it as a kind of healing process. Early on in my own Catholic conservative family, as a little effeminate boy who spoke differently and who moved differently, people made fun of me and made me feel like I was some kind of abomination. And it was heartbreaking and challenging. And eventually I understood that my work, my art practice, was a search for acceptance and for celebration of difference. About 2 decades ago, I began going into the world inviting people to create art pieces with me, to collaborate with me on impossible ideas. And in doing so, we became aware of our own agency, our own capacity to make the impossible happen. Allows us to understand that transformation in any form is possible. And I think it's part of the earth that is beckoning us forward. I think about my art practice like an experiment. I am iterative. I am interested in shifting and changing the way people think and inviting them to practice engaging with one another to change the way they think. When I think about the history of this process and of arriving here today, I think about coloring faith. My dear friend and the culture producer Nabila Alibai invited me to come to Nairobi when CNN said that Obama, our president, was going to be visiting a hotbed of terror. I think about going to Nairobi and collaborating with culture producers, filmmakers, novelists, all kinds of creative people. We sat in a circle and we had tea and we invited each other to think about if people are thinking about Nairobi as a place where only terror happens, where there's only these attacks of violence, and all of us were interested in creating not explosions of violence, but rather explosions of love and color and care that would allow the world to know that in this place, yeah, there were challenges and yeah, horrible things had happened, but we wanted to express the beauty and the magic of all of the other things that existed there that were not often named in the media. We talked about the notion of, could we create an ISIS of love? What does that look like? What does that feel like? Could we create explosions of color that make it impossible not to address our complete humanity, the thousands of stories, the millions of stories that exist in Nairobi and across Kenya that center mutual aid and well-being and beauty? At that point, I thought, what does that mean to create explosions of love, explosions of care? I remember clearly one morning, Sheikh Hamza from Kibera in the outside of Nairobi, he said, what if we paint these buildings the color of the sun, shines on all of us equally, without discriminating? And I thought, how beautiful could that happen? Could we invite Muslims, Christians, Hindus, people who believe differently from each other, to paint mosques, churches, temples yellow in the name of love? Eventually we did. We painted buildings from Nairobi to Mombasa that expressed our common humanity. But I often say that it was more beautiful to me to watch these people fall in love with each other as they painted these buildings yellow. They got to know their favorite food. They got to know what they do with their friends when they're hanging out on weekends. Those moments allowed them to forget the titles of who they think they are. How powerful to allow people to engage with each other and forget the prejudices and the ideas that held them back from friendship, from care, from love. In 2020, in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of one of the most challenging moments of the earth for us humans, Civic Engagement Commission in the city of New York selected me to be their artist in residence. And what's really beautiful about that is that it's the only city agency that has a mandate to build trust in our democracy. When I became the artist in residence, I realized, how do I get people to know this agency exists and that it is the only agency that has a mandate to build trust in our democracy? And how do we tell that story so people know that they have to support these agencies so that we can help our democracy thrive? I think all of our democracies are in peril. We have so many challenges. I think the question of trust and understanding what is the truth, what do we believe and how do we believe? Where do we get our information? To be able to build trust in our democracy is critical, and to be able to invite our governments to think about how beauty and joy are essential elements, essential ingredients to make our democracy sustainable is so important. So immediately I understood that when there were millions of people protesting on the streets for all of the racial violence and the continuous racism that exists, that is prevalent in our systems, how do we invite folks to transform that? And so I thought, we have to make our agency mobile. We need a bus, we need wheels. At first, people were like, oh, you're gonna need 4 years to be able to procure a bus within the government. And then I started asking questions about, no. How do we find the bus? Can we borrow one? Eventually, well, we got a Department of Corrections bus, a bus from Rikers Island, a prison in New York. We took that and used it to teach people how to vote. I remember one of the most beautiful parts of that story is that we had undocumented women in Spanish teaching other people how to vote, even though they themselves could not vote. Eventually, using participatory processes, we transformed the bus into an art piece that now goes around the city creating the People's Festival. The bus is called the People's Bus. And it's called the People's Bus because I think it's so central that in all of our work, we center people, their well-being, their needs. All of the folks that were involved in many of these processes come from the communities that were hardest hit by COVID. When you realize and you look at the data, the communities that are marginalized over and over again. How do we transform the way we think about what government should do and how it shows up with resources? And so for me, it was about centering the heart, centering the body, and saying, let's invite everybody to celebrate their resilience, the fact that we're still here. The interior of the bus is made of mirrors because I wanted people to see themselves in the context of a story that often is not associated with ourselves, right? Like the fact that that most jails and prisons in America are full of Black and brown folk, I think is problematic. And I think we have to shift. When I think about it, it's actually contemporary slavery. And so to be able to look at this punitive justice system and transform it requires a practice and an exercising of the imagination. Again and again, I invite people to think, we've made gymnasiums all over the world for our bodies. How do we make gymnasiums for the imagination and for the brain so we can practice a future we can only imagine together? So when I'm invited into community, often I say, what impossible things can we do together that we cannot do alone? And how, by doing that, do we prove to each other that the future that we want, that we desire, is possible and we can make manifest if only we engage with an exercising of the imagination. Again and again, in my practice, I invite people to think about impossible things and for us to do those things together. In the fall of 2019, right before the pandemic, I was invited to come to Bilbao, Spain to work with Judith Hemming. People were dealing with trauma, challenges that felt or that were generational trauma. We began to understand that people had an inheritance of pain and violence that really began with the civil war in Spain in the early 1900s. From that point forward, when we think about the history of this place and this land that I'm now on, the Basque Country, it was really incredible to realize that all of these people had pain and issues that had never been named collectively. This history of generational trauma is real to me because even though I was born in the United States, I grew up in Colombia in a family in the mountains of Medellin. There, my father was assassinated when I was 11 years old. Two of my uncles were kidnapped and tortured to death. And all of those things made the beginning of my life challenging. The truth is that now residing in New York and having spent a meaningful amount of my life in the United States, where there's a history of racial violence that has never been dealt with, I think about Brian Stevenson, who invites us to reckon with our history of violence to be able to create a healthy future. Here in Bilbao, Spain, in Medellin, Colombia, in the southern United States and across the United States, actually, we have a history of violence that collectively we do not want to address. Families from across the world continue to deal with violence and challenges that we have not faced or named. And if we cannot face or name these things, we cannot give them shape. Here in Bilbao, a nurse from Elorio, her name was Anne, said out loud, I'm hearing about all of this pain and I think, could we make a hospital for the soul? Un hospital para el alma. Un lugar donde la lluvia caiga y nos lave y nos limpie de toda la sangre y de toda la violencia que ha existido en nuestras comunidades. A place where the rain could fall and cleanse the blood of all of the violence that we've all endured for centuries, actually. As human beings, there's been so much, and I think we have to reckon with all of the people who have been killed, who have died, who have suffered. We have to honor those folks so we can make a future that includes them and honors them and makes us all whole, because we recognize that violence, along with our joy, and along with our beauty, and along with our wealth, it's, being able to think about all of these elements together. And so when that nurse said that, it made me think, what is a hospital for the soul? What does it mean to create a place that cleanses and that helps us see each other together in the construct of nature moving towards a healthy earth. What is that? So I kept thinking and I began drawing rooms. The first room that came to me was a room for the heart of the nose. A place that would have a eucalyptus tree in the middle, and that you would walk in and the scent, the smell of that tree would be so unavoidable, and it would go into your body and change you. And then I thought, it rains in Bilbao all the time. Can I help people think about the rain differently? Yeah, maybe there's a room that's only open when it's raining. And when it does, there's a 4-string quartet that plays, that changes how we feel about that rain. It makes it musical. Time and again, it was about how the hospital for the soul became a sequence of rooms in which our encounters with nature transform us. And then I thought, it's really critical that we be able to see ourselves, see our bodies here with each other in the context of a tree, to understand that without that tree and without each other, we cannot create health. We have to engage with one another in a process of shifting how we think and what is possible. Eventually, it was really beautiful. I spent about a week in Bilbao interviewing trees, sitting next to them, from the mountains to the river to the ocean. I was sitting next to trees, feeling their leaves and their bark and the ground that held them, trying to understand, is this the tree where we begin the hospital? Eventually, we got to a magnolia tree in a park in the middle of the city. Originally, I wanted it to be a local tree, a tree that has been growing here and that is natural to this place. My image of the tree that I wanted to be able to celebrate and to create a temple for became this magnolia tree, which actually is native to the southern United States. But as a person who has lived and grown in different parts of the world, I thought maybe this is more honest about where we come from and about the shifting and changing that's happening. And so as humans, the earth is transforming. How can we transform along with it? How do we engage in all of the changing that is happening everywhere? I often now ask the question, who is the chief change officer? Who is inviting us to practice transformation and change now so that we can be prepared for all of the things that are to come? And how can we honor that which we don't know yet? How do we honor that which we don't know? I say it again and again because I think so often as humans, we try to know, we try to be certain, we try to be prepared and organized and ready, but I think that there's so much we have yet to understand, that allowing ourselves to engage with that not knowing is valuable and it shifts us. I also think it's really critical that you know that as when I was growing up and I felt a lack of acceptance and lack of tolerance for myself, when I think about all of my work, I think about creating spaces where we celebrate all of our ways of being, all of our ways of moving and talking and laughing and crying. How do we accept it all and celebrate it, in spite of the discomfort that we might sometimes feel when we engage with difference? And so this hospital for the soul, really now what we created is a corner, the beginning of spaces that are to come. It's an invitation to imagine with me what is possible. One of the things that I say now more than ever too is that I cannot do my work alone. I can't write about it, I can't think about it, I can't paint it. I need people to do it with me. And I think that kind of vulnerability as a practice has changed me. I invite you all to engage with each other and to question and to see the violence and to see the history of where you come from so that you can be prepared and ready for the earth that is calling us forward. It's so important to ask the question, what are the things that we can create together that we cannot create alone? I am often interested in the impossible. What impossible things can we make together that show us that the transformation of the earth is happening and is on purpose and we are a part of it? If we can turn a Department of Corrections bus into a work of art that doubles as a mobile community center that celebrates our human resilience, what else is possible? If we can invite Muslims, Christians, and Hindus to paint their houses of worship yellow, mosques, temples, churches, in the name of love, what else is possible? If we can come together and name our history of violence and terror and look at it together to heal, to create a hospital where people accept themselves for exactly who they are, what else is possible? I think by engaging with impossible ideas and making them happen together, we can create the future of this earth that is healthy, that takes care of all living creatures. My art practice centers transformation, change, and vulnerability to achieve incredible things that show us that our human capacity is beyond what we've ever seen. And I invite people to participate in their own agency to make miracles happen. these are some of the stories of that process and of my work.